Mak is back. The model turned PI, created in Tara Moss's own image, is on the run and powerful people want her dead. Fortunately, the author herself is under no such threat. Tara Moss, welcome to Booktopia.
Thank you.
So where is Mak at in Assassin?
Well, Assassin is the sixth and final installment of the Mak Vanderwall series. So I've been writing Mak and her story for 15 years. And in a way, it's quite cathartic to end the series, but it's also it's a bit of an emotional thing, actually. And I guess what you could say is that with the debut novel, Fetish, we're introduced to Mak as a very strong, independent, smart woman, but also a woman who's a bit naive in particular ways. And through the series, we see that evolve. We see her become tougher. We see her become stronger. And in fact, she picks up a kind of skill set, if you will, through the series, through the extreme events that she's kind of involved with, so that by the time the sixth novel comes around, you can actually see her use that entire skill set, use all of the things she's learned through the whole series to become a really extraordinary character. But again, not she becomes an action hero of sorts, a sort of anti-hero, actually. But she's come to that honestly. I think by seeing her through the series, through the 6 books, and through this 15 years of writing, by seeing this evolution, I think the readers will be willing to go there. They'll be willing to sort of see that this is true to Mak, this story. And if we were just arriving and she was just that character, you might say she was a sort of Jason Bourne type or something, but we know this is Mak, and we know who she is and why she's been pushed to this point. So it's a very interesting book for me. It's the first time I've ended a series. Mak was my first character and my first publishing experience. So there's something quite wonderful about ending a series and particularly finishing her story. But it's also kind of a strange emotional farewell.
I bet. Now, at the beginning of the book, she's on the run, and as part of the process of being on the run, she has to disguise herself. She's a very striking woman, and I just wonder whether now that you've come to the end of the 6 books, whether the fact that you decided to make her a model, like yourself, was a bit of a burden, because the beauty is so much of a distraction and it attracts so much attention that it makes it much harder for her to disguise herself and pass unnoticed.
Sure. I think for me, when I was creating the first novel, I was writing it without a publisher, without a literary agent, and I was going on gut instinct. So I created a character I could intimately relate to. I've always thought of Mak as a kind of member of the family. She's like a sister, but not like my real life sister. So I guess I wanted someone who kind of comes from the same tribe, because all of the other characters, all the other scenarios in the books had to be researched heavily. I'd never really met a cop until I started researching the series, and now I know a lot about that world. So I created Mak with this kind of, this base position, a character I didn't need to second guess. And I made her a model because that was something I didn't need to second guess at the time. When I wrote Fetish, it was between modeling jobs, and I quit modeling when the book came out 13 years ago. But I never really overthought the idea that she was beautiful. And I guess I wanted to create a scenario in which it seemed reasonable, within a fictional context, that she could be a psychomagnet, which is the term I use in the books. She attracts trouble, and why? It's not fully something you can account for just because she's striking, tall, beautiful. There is something else, some other element that kind of has drawn her into these difficult situations we see in the novels. But the beauty is part of that. The fact that she stands out. It's hard for her, and I wanted to make it hard for her. And that was part of the central premise of the series, really to bring her into that much trouble on a personal level, not just professional level. You kind of have to have a reason, and I think that was part of how I created that premise.
You say that she attracts these kind of psychomagnets, but in what way have the kinds of criminals that she's going after changed? For example, in Assassin, we're seeing a level of society which is the rich, the powerful, people who are highly visible, and who are able to kind of do all sorts of dirty deeds very covertly. They're different from the sorts of serial killers that Mak met in earlier incarnations.
If you look at this series, all 6 novels can be kind of broken down into 2 trilogies in a sense. So you're learning about Mak and watching her evolution throughout as the bigger character arc, but also there's common villains through the first trilogy and the second. And the first trilogy is centered around the Stiletto murderer, who of course does play a part in the final book without giving too much away. There's that kind of tying up, exactly, making it come together as a series as well. But in the second half of the series is the 3 novels that are based around the Cavanaghs. And that begins with Hit. So Hit, Siren, and Assassin all are very much based around the Cavanaghs as your kind of ultimate, the bad guys who can't be brought in. And I wanted to create that scenario for Mak, but also for the police characters, the investigators in this series, because in real life that is very, very difficult as a situation. You have an extremely corrupt, powerful family, not one-dimensional corrupt. In fact, there are moments where you actually feel for Jack Cavanagh and the difficult decisions that he has to make, but ultimately he's a corrupt figure, and he's so influential and so powerful that he's almost impossible to bring down. And you know that when he goes down, he will bring down, a lot of the police force with him, political figures, people he's got in his pockets, and it's believable and authentic because we know that this happens. It's not based on any real life case that we see in the papers, but there's elements out there, and I think as the reading public, we're becoming more aware that these situations have been going on for decades, that there have been certain people that are above the law, if you will. And that's what I wanted to focus on in the second half of the series.
What about the status of profiling, which I know has held a great deal of interest for you? Now, in this book, it becomes clear that the police have a slightly sort of contemptuous attitude towards profiling. What's happened there?
Well, what I've done in terms of Andy Flynn, my character, was a detective and now is an agent. He is a profiler. He's staked his career on his ability to be a great criminal profiler. And through the beginning of the series, he has some breakthroughs with the Stiletto murder case. And so that part of his career takes off. And unfortunately for him, profiling goes out of fashion within law enforcement. And this has happened in real life. So around the time of the Silence of the Lambs, released in 1990, profiling became extremely popular. The world over suddenly became very interested. There were television shows, there were lots of people enrolling in these courses, wanting to get into law enforcement, studying psychology for this precise thing. And then a few things started to unravel. There was a few pieces that have come out, and I mentioned some of them in the paper. There's a piece that came out in the New Yorker, another piece that came out somewhere else. It kind of picked apart some of the mythology around these high-profile figures in profiling, and found basically that the science wasn't entirely as good as people wanted to believe, as good as it was presented. That's a really tough one, because when I first started writing this series, I was very into John Douglas and Robert K. Ressler, and they're both still iconic figures. But the type of profiling that they represented and that they pioneered has taken a really rough and tumble few hits in recent decades. And when you speak to most police officers now, they go, "Oh, we don't do that anymore." They have types of profiling, but it's different. The forms of profiling that I describe in the first part of the series are quite literally out of fashion in law enforcement. And that's what's happened in the last 20 years.
What about the way PIs and the police interact? Because I was talking to Gabrielle Lord about this recently,
Yes.
and she was saying that this has really changed, and that it used to be the case that those people went to the same bars and pubs and they would swap information, and there was a kind of porosity and a sense of sharing information that there isn't now. And that now, as a PI, her character Gemma Lincoln is very much excluded and has to rely on her friendship with someone inside the police force to get little sort of crumbs of information. So where does that leave your Mak?
Well, Mak has been doing PI work quite successfully, but it's actually put a real wedge between her and Andy in the series. And we saw this particularly with Hit and Siren, that there was this wedge driven between them because he didn't want her to be doing that work. And that reflects really the response you get from police officers about private investigators. They're pretty ostracized for the most part. There's a family there in terms of some of these ex-cops who've got their own firms, but everybody treads very carefully because there's not the ability now to just pass on information without being accountable. It's very heavily policed within policing.
There are digital trails of every bit of data that you access so that you can't disguise that or share it anymore.
Precisely, and this was the difficulty in my series, is I wanted to have a bad egg, and I've built him up through the book. I needed to have a cop who was corrupt because of this corrupt family, and it's difficult. It's actually difficult to do that in a realistic way because it's not the 70s and 80s where it was sort of, real cowboy territory. Now there's a digital imprint of everything that you do. There's accountability all the way up the line, and it's very difficult to pass on information to PIs or journalists. So you find a lot of journalists are put out now and a bit ostracized, as well as the private investigators, because every time they call, they want something, and the police can't give it to them. They're not willing to put their careers on the line, and why would they? And you can't even peek at a case file on the computer without it being noted that you looked at that case file, and there needs to be a reason. So it's very difficult now to just kind of go, I'll check that to you and I'll slip you the file. It doesn't happen now. No. Makes it very tricky.
You now have a daughter. She's very young. She's only 1.5 years, Sapphira. But if your daughter grew up, Tara, and said that she wanted to either be a model or a private investigator, which of those career paths would worry you more?
Oh, that's a tough one. Which one would worry me more? I don't think either of them would truly worry me, but they would both come with warnings. With modeling, it's a short-lived but interesting way to see the world, and I would be wanting to prepare her for rejection, which is you get a lot of. Unfair criticism about your physical appearance, because it's all about physical appearance, and kind of give her the tools to deal with that. It's not a great thing for young women, but like I said, it was a great way for me to see the world. So who am I to judge if that's really what she wants to do? PI work is pretty tough, and actually a lot of the bread and butter is either insurance claims or domestics, and domestics are pretty sad. It's a legitimate line of work, but it feels pretty weird when you're doing it. And when I was out in the field doing domestics, there's some essential part of me that just felt like I was being really creepy by stalking people and recording everything they're doing. This is the job description. It's called surveillance, but in real life you're stalking someone and they don't know that you're doing it. And it feels essentially wrong to me on some kind of basic level. Really interesting work, and for some reason you feel kind of vindicated when you do see them do something horrible, cheating on their spouse. You kind of go, oh, thank goodness, because I thought I was following this innocent man around for days, and I start to feel like a really bad person. And then when they do something horrible, you kind of feel like, okay, now I can see why we're here, But it is awful, you're seeing the worst part of human nature. So I'd say both careers have a downside. Certainly there's a lot more longevity in private eye work, though.
This is the last in the Mak series, and Tara Moss challenges her heroine physically and mentally, giving her the adrenaline-charged send-off she deserves.